Hello, everyone. I'm Linda Walsh, a partner in Husch Blackwell's Energy and Natural Resources Group. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console, there are multiple application icons for your use during the program today. If you have any questions during the webcast, please submit questions via the question box. We may be able to answer questions during the webcast today, but if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, it'll be answered later by email. A PDF presentation of the presentation is available in the program materials folder. This program has been approved for legal education hours. For live attendees, report your hours by clicking on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. Toward the end of the program, be sure to complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your business needs. That is all for the housekeeping items, and I'd like to now get started with our program. Joining me today are Sylvia Bartell and Mike Blackwell. Sylvia specializes in electric transmission regulation and renewable energy development. Sylvia focuses on issues regarding modernizing the electric grid and accelerating renewable energy projects across the U.S. Michael Blackwell counsels clients on matters relating to state and federal regulation of the electric power industry. I'm going to start the presentation by going over some of the NOPR background. So the proposed reforms in the NOPR are intended to remedy deficiencies in the Commission's existing regional transmission planning and cost allocation requirements. The NOPR builds on FERC's previous orders, orders 888, 890, and 1000, in which FERC incrementally developed the requirements that are currently applicable for regional transmission planning today. FERC notes in the NOPR that the resource mix is changing as generation shifts from resources located close to population centers toward resources that are located far from load centers. FERC also notes that the changing new resources seeking to interconnect to the transmission system have different characteristics, and that creates new demands on the transmission system. As a result, FERC contends that Order 1000 processes are not planning transmission on a sufficiently long-term, forward-looking basis to meet transmission needs driven by changes in the resource mix and demand. So the need for reform, Commission posits that the current transmission planning processes can actually lead to inefficient and not cost-effective transmission development. The long-term regional transmission planning and cost allocation that identifies and plans for transmission needs driven by changes in the resource mix and demand is not occurring in most transmission planning regions on a regular or consistent basis. FERC notes that since Order 1000 was issued, a disproportionate share of transmission facilities have been developed outside the regional transmission planning processes. The Commission suggests that this results in less efficient and less cost-effective transmission development. A significant amount of new transmission facilities have been developed through interconnection-related network upgrades constructed for generator interconnection requests. And FERC suggests that this kind of development is problematic because the interconnection process was just not designed to consider how to efficiently or cost-effectively address transmission needs beyond what's being studied for the particular interconnection. According to FERC, since Order 1000 was issued, a majority of new investment in transmission facilities has been in local transmission facilities. FERC suggests that Order 1000, which was intended to increase regional planning, is thus not working. The NOPR proposes to require public utility transmission providers to conduct long-term regional transmission planning on a sufficiently forward-looking basis to meet transmission needs driven by changes in the resource mix and demand. The FERC's general requirements in the NOPR are that transmission providers must develop long-term scenarios that account for low-frequency, high-impact events. Transmission providers must evaluate the benefits of regional transmission facilities over a 20-plus year time horizon. And transmission providers must establish transparent and not unduly discriminatory criteria to select transmission facilities in collaboration with states and stakeholders. I'll go into more detail on each of these requirements. Transmission providers must identify transmission needs driven by changes in the resource mix and demand through the development of long-term scenarios, including scenarios that account for low-frequency, high-impact events such as extreme weather events. FERC does not define low-frequency, high-impact events except to include extreme weather events and also cyber attacks as examples in the NOPR. Other possible events, although not specified in the NOPR, could vary by region and could include electromagnetic pulses, widespread vegetation outages, sabotage, terrorism, etc. Long-term scenario planning, according to FERC, must include at least a 20-year planning horizon. It must be reassessed at least once every 3 years, and each assessment must conclude before the next one starts, so there are no overlapping assessments. Long-term scenarios must also include a set of commission-identified categories of factors that drive transmission needs driven by changes in resource mix and demand. At a minimum, the Commission's identified categories include the ones listed on this slide. These 7 categories are a combination of legally binding obligations, such as 1, 2, and 3, which incorporate federal, state, and local laws and regulations or state-approved integrated resource plans. Some are straightforward, relatively straightforward facts to incorporate, such as 5 and 6, which are resources that are retiring and needs identified in the generator interconnection process. Some of the factors incorporate a certain amount of discretion, such as 4 and 7, which FERC acknowledges are less binding, likely to change, and may vary significantly by regions. Additional categories of factors can be incorporated if the transmission provider demonstrates that the incorporation of more than the minimum is consistent with or superior to the final rule. The adopted list of factors must be posted on the transmission provider's OASIS, and the OATT planning process must provide stakeholders and states with opportunity to propose potential factors and provide input on how less certain factors can be discounted in the process. Order 1000 already requires that federal, state, and local laws and regulations and state-approved resource plans be incorporated in regional planning. Item 6 is relatively new, appears to be a new requirement, making factors 4 and 7 flexible or voluntary. It's not clear whether this is actually a new requirement because they're not required and voluntary. It's not clear whether these are going to be definitive requirements in the final rule. Some issues that could be the subject of comments on these factors include: how should the process be developed to provide stakeholders and states with an opportunity to propose potential factors without actually causing delays or deadlocks? What kind of veto authority would stakeholders or states have in determining the factors that must be committed and what must be incorporated? Transmission providers must develop a plausible, diverse set of at least 4 distinct long-term scenarios that evaluate transmission needs across multiple scenarios using different assumptions about future electric power system over the long-term forward-looking horizon. Long-term scenarios must use best available data, which is data developed using best practices and regularly updated with stakeholder input. At least one of the 4 long-term scenarios must account for the need for transmission facilities during high-impact, low-frequency events. Transmission provider can assume a greater than expected demand and outages in that scenario. FERC's goal is that by utilizing multiple long-term scenarios, transmission providers can better understand potential future transmission needs under multiple reasonably likely scenarios. It can help them assess the implications of changing market conditions and policies. And transmission providers can also manage uncertainties about future system conditions and better identify more efficient or cost-effective regional transmission facilities by evaluating which transmission facilities are beneficial under multiple scenarios. According to FERC, this will mitigate the risks of underbuilding or overbuilding transmission identified through the long-term regional transmission planning. With respect to these long-term scenarios, FERC is seeking comments on various aspects of this proposed requirement. Some of the questions that FERC is seeking comments on include whether transmission providers should be required to incorporate some form of scenario analysis into their existing reliability and economic regional transmission planning processes, whether using a 20-year planning horizon is appropriate, whether a frequency of no less than 3 years is appropriate, whether and how the categories of factors listed adequately capture factors that are expected to drive changes in the resource mix and demand, whether 4 long-term scenarios will provide enough information to transmission providers, whether transmission providers should be required to develop sensitivities for these long-term scenarios, and whether the proposed definition of best available data input should be expanded, and whether the commission itself should identify or standardize the best available data inputs for the long-term scenarios. FERC proposes that transmission providers consider whether to identify geographic zones with the potential for development of large amounts of new generation and where the anticipated generation resources are most likely to materialize. FERC proposes that geographic zones be developed using best available data, including atmospheric, meteorological, geophysical, and other surveys to identify the geographic zones. Transmission providers should also use information about existing resources in the zone region, interconnection requests, land leasing agreements, letters of credit, power purchase agreements, and that sort of information. The transmission provider's process used to identify geographic zones must be outlined in the OATT and use the best available data and allow stakeholder input. Transmission providers must also identify known siting challenges or opportunities with the identified geographic zones and post maps. FERC seeks comments on this requirement specifically on how transmission providers in multi-state transmission planning regions can account for different state energy policy interests in implementing the geographic zones while respecting and not overriding those state preferences. Transmission providers must evaluate the benefits of regional transmission facilities to meet needs over a minimum of 20 years, starting from the estimated in-service date of the transmission facilities. Because the 20-year evaluation timeframe starts from the estimated in-service date, the actual time period could be many more than 20 years. FERC has not proposed to prescribe any particular definition of benefits or beneficiaries, or require the use of any specific benefits. As with Order 100, FERC allows for regional flexibility and will consider use of benefits on review of compliance proposals submitted by transmission providers. FERC provides a set of minimum benefits that transmission providers may consider in their long-term regional transmission plan. In a compliance filing, transmission providers must identify the benefits they will evaluate and use, how the benefits will be calculated, and explain how the benefits reflect the benefits of transmission needs driven by changes in resource mix and the rationale for using them. In the NOPR, FERC proposes a common set of benefits, which is not an exhaustive list, and transmission providers have flexibility to propose what benefits to use. The list of 12 benefits shown on this slide are the kinds of, most of these are kinds of benefits currently used in transmission planning. Some may be overlapping. FERC did not provide a lot of detail as to how these benefits are defined. FERC has asked for comments on each of the enumerated benefits proposed, such as how to ensure that each type of benefit is distinct, such that the list does not double count benefits. FERC also seeks comments on whether transmission providers should be required to use some or all of the benefits as a minimum set for their long-term regional planning process, and the time horizon for evaluating the benefits. On the opposite side of benefits, FERC proposes that costs of transmission facilities also be estimated over the same 20-plus year time horizon. Transmission providers can propose approaches that exceed the minimum requirements, given that transmission facilities could provide significant benefits over their entire useful life. FERC encourages transmission providers to evaluate benefits using a portfolio approach. The NOPR provides flexibility to use the portfolio approach, but doesn't require it. According to FERC, portfolios may benefit because there may be more stable, show more stable benefits and more evenly distributed benefits over time. Transmission providers that decide to use a portfolio approach must include OATT provisions describing how the benefits will be analyzed. And FERC seeks comments on whether there might be some circumstances where Commission should require the use of portfolio approach in transmission planning. FERC does not propose to change Order 1000's requirements for transmission providers with respect to existing reliability and economic planning requirements. Only transmission needs driven by public policy requirements are affected by the new long-term regional transmission planning requirements. Transmission providers can continue to rely on their existing regional transmission planning and cost allocation processes to comply with Order 1000's requirements related to transmission needs driven by reliability concerns or economic considerations. Transmission providers would be deemed to comply with the existing Order 1000 requirement to consider needs driven by public policy requirements through the proposed new long-term regional transmission planning process. FERC proposes to allow transmission providers to continue using some or all aspects of the existing regional transmission planning and cost allocation processes that they currently use to consider public policy requirements, but transmission providers would have to demonstrate that their continued use of an existing process does not undermine the long-term regional transmission planning required in the NOPR. The new long-term transmission regional transmission planning must comply with the requirements, the current requirements in Orders 890 and 1000 for coordination, openness, transparency, information exchange, comparability, and dispute resolution. FERC is proposing to require transmission providers to coordinate their regional transmission planning and their generator interconnection processes. Specifically, FERC's proposing to require transmission providers to consider in the long-term regional transmission plan regional facilities that address interconnection-related needs that have been identified in 2 or more interconnection cycles during the preceding 5 years, but have not been constructed due to the withdrawal of interconnection requests. The identified upgrades must be at least 200 kV or higher and or cost at least $30 million. The upgrades are limited to interconnection needs not already addressed in an executed generator interconnection agreement. FERC seeks comments on this proposal, such as whether the proposal could delay the processing of existing interconnection queues and what reforms, if any, would be necessary to ensure that there are no delays. FERC also seeks comments on the appropriateness of the criteria FERC proposes a transmission provider must use to identify the interconnection-related needs that should be considered in the regional transmission planning process, and whether there are alternative criteria that transmission providers may use to identify significant interconnection-related needs that should be considered in the regional transmission planning process. Transmission providers must establish transparent and not unduly discriminatory criteria to select transmission facilities in the regional transmission plan in collaboration with states and other stakeholders. FERC provides flexibility in proposing the selection criteria, which could include, for example, a least regrets or a weighted benefits approach. FERC proposes that a transmission provider's OATT contain a process to coordinate with the relevant state entities in developing such criteria, which FERC indicates is becoming more important as states take a more active role in shaping the resource mix and demand. FERC seeks comments on whether relevant state entities should have the opportunity to voluntarily fund the cost of or a portion of a long-term regional transmission facility to enable the facility to satisfy the transmission provider's selection criteria, for example, to meet a benefit cost threshold. And if so, whether the final rule should include requirements to facilitate such an opportunity for state funding. FERC also asks whether there should be an opportunity for relevant state entities to voluntarily fund the cost or a portion of the cost of the regional plans, and if that should be limited to states or expanded to include interconnection customers. On the implementation issues, FERC proposes that transmission providers explain in a compliance filing how the initial timing sequence for their long-term regional transmission planning interacts with their existing regional transmission planning efforts. In this regard, FERC seeks comments on whether there's a need to coordinate the initial timing sequence between the long-term regional transmission planning and the existing near-term regional transmission planning processes. FERC also seeks comments on whether the Commission should hold a periodic forum for transmission providers, transmission experts, and federal and state agencies to share best practices in implementing long-term regional transmission planning processes. FERC is also asking whether it would be helpful for FERC to hold technical conferences on topics such as choosing the best available data, principles for developing plausible scenarios, and techniques for evaluating benefits of proposed transmission facilities. The Commission is also proposing to require that transmission providers in each transmission planning region more fully consider in a regional transmission plan processes for two specific technologies: dynamic line ratings and advanced power control devices. Two key components of the Commission's requirements are, first, whether incorporating dynamic line ratings or advanced power flow devices into existing transmission facilities could meet the same regional transmission need more efficiently or cost effectively than other potential transmission facilities. And second, whether evaluating transmission facilities for potential selection in the regional transmission plan for purposes of cost allocation, the transmission providers in the transmission planning region would also be required to consider whether incorporating dynamic line ratings and advanced power flow control devices would be more efficient or cost effective. For these requirements, FERC is asking whether there are other transmission technologies serving a transmission function that should be considered in regional transmission planning, and whether non-RTO ISO transmission planning regions should be required to update their EMS systems if dynamic line ratings are identified as a more efficient or cost-effective transmission facility for selection in the regional transmission plan. Next, I'll turn the discussion over to Sylvia to go over the cost allocation provisions in the NOPR.
Thank you, Linda. That brings us, as Linda mentioned, to the Commission's proposed reforms regarding cost allocation of the transmission facilities that are selected through the transmission planning process that Linda just detailed. The NOPR proposes to require transmission providers to seek the agreement of the relevant state entities within the planning region on the cost allocation method that applies to the facilities selected through the long-term regional transmission planning process. In proposing this requirement, the Commission reasoned that providing state regulators with a formal opportunity to develop a cost allocation method could increase state and stakeholder support. In turn, it could help ensure that the identified transmission facilities actually get built instead of blocked. The Commission emphasized that states have an active role in resource planning and determining the future resource mix, both of which affect long-term transmission needs. So, the Commission reasoned, it is important that states have an active role in cost allocation. As part of this proposed cost allocation requirement, public utility transmission providers would be required to seek the agreement of the relevant state entities within their region to revise their OAT, or Open Access Transmission Tariff, to include either 1, a long-term regional transmission cost allocation method to allocate the costs of the long-term regional transmission facilities, or a state agreement process by which one or more relevant state entities may voluntarily agree to a cost allocation method, or a combination of the two. State agreement process is defined as an ex post cost allocation process that may apply to an individual long-term regional transmission facility or a portfolio of such facilities grouped together for purposes of cost allocation. If states can reach an agreement, the agreed-to process would be followed to establish a cost allocation method for the facilities after they are selected in the regional transmission plan. If the Commission subsequently approves the cost allocation method that results from this state agreement process, the developer of the transmission facility would be entitled to use that cost allocation method. Transmission providers must establish a process in their OATT, to provide states with a time period to negotiate a cost allocation method that is different than any ex-ante regional cost allocation method that would otherwise apply. If unanimous state agreement is not reached, or if FERC rejects a state proposed method, the transmission developer would be entitled to use any ex-ante regional cost allocation method that would otherwise apply for the facility. Now, moving on to compliance with the proposed requirement. Transmission providers, if this rule is adopted, or if this proposal is adopted, must explain how the proposed long-term transmission cost allocation method, the proposed state agreement process, or a combination of the two, either reflect the agreement of the relevant state entities, or, if agreement is not reached, an explanation of the good faith efforts made to obtain agreement. If the relevant state entities decide on a state agreement process, the transmission provider must detail the process by which, 1, the relevant state entities would reach voluntary agreement regarding cost allocation, including a timeline for such processes. 2, when and how such voluntary agreements may be filed with FERC pursuant to Federal Power Act Section 205. And 3, how the relevant state entities would agree to funding contributions and the mechanisms to allocate costs. One example that FERC identifies is through a pro forma contract. Additionally, FERC proposes to require that transmission providers identify the following in their compliance filings: the benefits they will use in any ex-ante cost allocation method associated with long-term regional transmission planning, how they will calculate those benefits, and how the benefits will reasonably reflect the benefits of regional transmission facilities to meet identified transmission needs driven by changes in the resource mix and demand. So, what constitutes state agreement? The NOPR states that the Commission will afford flexibility in this determination. However, the Commission directs that a single state entity should be designated as the voting or representative entity to avoid confusion or overrepresentation by a single state in a multi-state voting process. Existing processes may be used, or state entities may elect to use new or different ways to communicate their agreement. The Commission provided the following examples of how state agreement could be defined. For example, in New England, the New England States Committee on Electricity has bylaws that define the threshold of agreement among the relevant state entities. And in MISO, the Organization of MISO States has procedures to define agreement and to convey its positions to MISO. The Commission also identified the following examples of state involvement in transmission planning. SPP's Regional State Committee is one such example, and PJM's State Agreement Approach is another. Under PJM's State Agreement Approach, a state in PJM identifies specific public policy requirements to be included in PJM's Regional Transmission Expansion Plan, referred to as RTEP. PJM then opens a competitive proposal window at the state's request, and then the state selects its preferred project, which PJM will include in the RTEP. The state is allowed to assign capacity of the selected project for a limited amount of time. FERC requested comments on several specific areas of its proposed cost allocation requirements. Depending on how the record is developed with comments, this provides an idea on specific areas where the final rule could depart from the proposals in the NOPR. The Commission's comment requests appear to recognize that achieving voluntary agreement from states may be difficult in practice. While some state agreement may be possible, it may be very challenging to achieve state agreement on the scale needed. The specific areas for comment on state agreement proposals include how to resolve the potential inability of states to reach agreement. Separately, what is the outcome that would be appropriate when states fail to agree on a cost allocation method? For example, should transmission providers be required to establish a cost allocation method? Alternatively, should the relevant states be given more time to reach agreement? Or should the Commission itself establish a cost allocation methodology? Separately, the Commission seeks comments on how prescriptive it should be on benefits identification. Linda identified many of the benefits earlier in this webinar. On this topic, FERC asks, should it require transmission providers to account for the full list of benefits identified in the NOPR, or is it unnecessary to change the benefits currently used in the existing regional transmission planning processes? Commenting on this topic provides another avenue for the industry to advocate for retention of the status quo on benefits, or, by contrast, to advocate for a holistic identification of benefits and analysis of benefits, often referred to as de-siloing of transmission benefits. With that, I will turn it over to Mike.
Thanks, Sylvia. I will now continue by discussing the Commission's proposed reforms regarding construction work in progress, or CWIP. In Order Number 679, the Commission adopted incentive-based rate treatments to promote capital investment in transmission infrastructure and address impediments faced by transmission investors. To remove this impediment, the Commission adopted its proposal to allow for the recovery of 100% of CWIP costs into rate base, but only in certain circumstances. Allowing transmission developers to include construction costs in rate base prior to commercial operation provides utilities with additional cash flow in the form of an immediate earned return, rather than delaying recovery of those costs until the plant is placed into service. Now, the NOPR proposes to not permit transmission providers to take advantage of the CWIP incentive for certain facilities, specifically those regional transmission facilities selected for purposes of cost allocation through long-term regional transmission planning, or LTRTP. According to FERC, the benefits of CWIP mainly accrue to transmission providers and shareholders during construction. Ratepayers do not see benefits until a facility is placed in service. Ratepayers may finance construction and never see benefits if a facility is never placed in service. FERC states in the NOPR that because of incremental uncertainty associated with LTRTP, additional protection for ratepayers is necessary to reasonably balance consumers' interests in maintaining just and reasonable rates against investors' interests in earning a return on their investments. Also, FERC is interested in reducing the risk to ratepayers of potentially financing overinvestment in regional transmission facilities. There is opportunity for stakeholders to provide FERC with comments on whether this proposal actually achieves a reasonable balance of consumer and investor interests, and whether the proposal, if implemented, would meaningfully reduce the risk to ratepayers of potentially financing overinvestment in regional transmission facilities. Next, we will discuss the Commission's proposed changes to the Federal Right of First Refusal, or ROFR. Order number 1000 required transmission providers to eliminate federal ROFRs from jurisdictional tariffs, except for new or upgraded local transmission facilities in a utility's retail service territory, or certain, quote, immediate need reliability projects. This unconditional mandate rationalized on the basis, or rather was rationalized on the basis, that ROFRs create a barrier to entry for non-incumbents, preclude investment opportunities for non-incumbent developers, and thwart the benefits of competition. In Order 1000, FERC therefore determined that eliminating ROFRs would produce a more just and reasonable result. Now, in the NOPR, the Commission proposes to revisit the ROFR elimination rules and reassess whether incumbents were incentivized to focus instead on local project incentives where they may have had access to a ROFR. In its rationale, the NOPR cites the failure of competitive processes to produce significant investment in regional transmission after Order 1000, and for the potential to allow, quote, misaligned incentives. The NOPR restates support for the theoretically sound policy foundation, as FERC put it, that underlies the Commission's elimination of the unconditional exercise of the federal ROFR under Order 1000. The Commission continues to deem such unconditional ROFRs as unjust and unreasonable. It then proposes to use the discretion afforded by the Federal Power Act in Section 309 to modify the findings and mandates in Order 1000 by concluding preliminarily that Order 1000 may have been overly broad and, quote, may have overlooked the possibility that conditions could be applied to the use of federal ROFRs, which would make their exercise just and reasonable and not unduly discriminatory or preferential. As an alternative to Order 1000's mandate, the NOPR preliminarily finds that incumbent public utility transmission providers may choose to propose new ROFRs on regionally selected projects on the condition that the incumbent also establish joint ownership of the facilities with unaffiliated, non-incumbent transmission developers, or with another unaffiliated entity. According to the NOPR, this proposed reform will help ensure just and reasonable rates and limit opportunities for undue discrimination. The final rule on ROFR is still subject to FERC's consideration of numerous factors. The Commission will be considering comments on many questions, including, how does this proposed conditional ROFR align with or advance the goals of Order 1000 reforms? What challenges exist with the implementation and administration of joint ownership conditions of the federal ROFR? What specific requirements should the Commission impose on joint ownership agreements and on the process of formulating them? Should the ROFR option be limited to proposals that form or expand an inclusive transmission-only company or shared system arrangement? Should the transmission-dependent utilities or load-serving entities in the service territory of the proposed facility be given the opportunity to participate in a joint ownership arrangement? What standards should govern whether particular joint ownership arrangements qualify? What eligibility and participation criteria should be required for jointly owned transmission facilities and partners? Finally, should the Commission pursue broader reforms to its rules and regulations governing the federal ROFR, up to and including full restoration of the federal ROFR that was eliminated in Order 1000? That concludes discussion on the ROFR. The next NOPR topic that we will cover is enhanced transparency in the local transmission planning process and identifying potential opportunities to right-size replacement transmission facilities. Generally, the transmission facilities included in transmission providers' local transmission plans are incorporated into regional transmission plans as inputs, with minimal opportunity for stakeholder review in the regional process. This is because the analysis of local transmission plans in the regional transmission planning process is limited mainly to a reliability analysis to ensure that local transmission plans do not negatively affect the reliability of the regional transmission system. Local planning is largely based on reliability. The Commission has found that there is no requirement that public utility transmission providers provide information about potential in-kind replacements of existing transmission facilities in either their local or regional transmission planning processes. So, facilities being considered for retail needs, including in-kind replacements, are not reflected in regional plans. The NOPR makes clear that FERC is concerned as to whether transmission providers assess the benefits of deferred or avoided transmission investment. FERC expressed a desire for replacement decisions to align with evaluation of alternatives. It questioned the transparency of current evaluative processes and is sensitive to the development of local transmission impacted by ROFR elimination. Overall, FERC is concerned that there is lack of transparency for stakeholders in local transmission plans, lack of regional local planning coordination, lack of standards, and the existence of uneven processes. FERC needs to ensure transmission owners and transmission providers consider right-sizing and supply sufficient information. In-kind replacement of facilities is not required to be compliant with the requirements of Order 890, and thus the process fails to identify opportunities to improve transmission or prevent development of duplicative or unnecessary transmission. FERC proposed to amend processes to increase transparency to distinguish right-sized replacement facilities selected for cost allocation from transmission that is included in the regional plan for informational purposes only. FERC's stated objective is to allow customers and stakeholders to evaluate all findings. FERC proposes several requirements to address these issues. First, FERC proposes that transmission provider tariffs must be revised to enhance transparency regarding several factors: criteria, models, and assumptions used by transmission owners for planning local projects, determining local transmission needs, and the potential local or regional needs evaluation. Also, transmission owners must conduct an iterative process to identify opportunities to input through transmission planning processes by conducting at least 3 local transmission stakeholder meetings before local plans can be incorporated into regional planning models. And within an LTRTP cycle, Transmission providers must evaluate whether transmission at or above 230 kilovolts that is slated to be replaced in kind should be, quote, right-sized to meet regional needs. Transmission providers must review and evaluate whether existing transmission schedules for replacement can be right-sized to meet long-term needs. In the NOPR, FERC found that transmission facilities of 230 kilovolts and above that are slated for replacement are best suited to be right-sized using a 10-year window and balancing the long lead time estimates and uncertainties. If a right-sized in-kind estimate is selected for LTRTP cost allocation purposes, the incremental cost of right-sizing is regionally allocated. There is no change in the transmission owner's ability to build in its footprint if the project is not in the regional plan, and there is no obligation to replace an existing line. On these right-sizing objectives, the direction that FERC ultimately goes in its final rule will depend on a number of factors still under consideration. What are the requirements that should be incorporated to determine how transmission providers assess the incremental costs of right-sizing the transmission facility? Is there additional information from transmission owners that would help transmission providers identify in-kind replacement of an existing transmission facility that could be right-sized to address a LTRTP transmission need? What level of burden would such a requirement impose on the transmission owners? What level of burden is justified? Finally, is there additional information beyond a list of in-kind replacement estimates that transmission providers need in order to calculate such benefits? How to obtain that information? Next, we will discuss components of the NOPR that address interregional transmission coordination. The NOPR proposes that transmission providers in neighboring transmission planning regions should be required to revise their existing interregional coordination procedures and regional transmission planning processes as needed in order to require the following. First, sharing of information regarding the respective transmission needs identified in the LTRTP, as well as potential transmission facilities to meet those needs. Also, identification and joint evaluation of interregional transmission facilities that may be more efficient or cost-effective transmission facilities to address transmission needs identified through LTRTP. And revision to interregional transmission coordination procedures by neighboring transmission planning regions to allow the proposal of interregional transmission facilities in the regional transmission planning process as a potential solution to the needs identified in the LTRTP. At this time, FERC does not propose changes to the existing interregional transmission coordination and cost allocation requirements of Order 1000. Finally, we will talk about NOPR compliance. The Commission proposes to extend the compliance period in order to coordinate with relevant state entities and other stakeholders on proposed reforms. The Commission will require that each transmission provider submit a compliance filing within 8 months of the effective date of any final rule in this proceeding. The Commission may issue additional orders as necessary after compliance to ensure that each public utility transmission provider meets the requirements of any final rule. Transmission providers that are not public utilities will also have to adopt the requirements of this NOPR as a condition of maintaining the status of their safe harbor tariffs and Order 888 reciprocity requirements. FERC seeks comment on the NOPR proposal. Initial comments are due on August 17, 2022. Reply comments will be due on September 19, 2022. This concludes the substantive portion of our presentation. If you submitted a question in the Q&A box, we will reach out to you soon to provide answers. If you have any further questions, of course, you can always reach out to Linda, Sylvia, or me via email. Thank you for joining us today. We hope the information was helpful to you and your organization. As a reminder, this program has been approved for continuing legal education hours. To report your hours, please click on the CEU icon at the bottom of your screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for rewatching and sharing. Please be sure to complete our short survey. It will pop up on your screen at the end of this webinar. We will use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your business needs. This concludes the webinar. Thank you.